In the previous clips, we have changed these event classes in the Friend Organizer application so that we can reuse them for different detail views. But we have still one bug in our application, at least one bug I know about. Let me show it to you. So I run the application. When I try to create a new friend, we get an exception in the onOpenDetailView method in the main view model. When we try to access the viewModel name property of the OpenDetailView event args, we get a null reference exception. As you can see, the args are null. When I open up the call stack window, you can see that this method has been called by the onCreateNewFriendExecute method. So I double click here. In the onCreateNewFriendExecute method, we just pass a null argument to the onOpenDetailView method. So instead of passing null, we should pass here new OpenDetailView event args, and we should set the viewModel name property to the name of the friend detail view model. Instead of hard-coding this command handler to the friend detail view model, we can also use a more generic approach. I add a parameter here in this method that is of type type, and I call it viewModelType. Now I can use that parameter here instead of the name of the friend detail view model, and I just grab the name from that type. Now I think you agree that the implementation of this onCreateNewFriendExecute method is friend independent. So let's rename that method. I press F2 and I rename it to onCreateNewDetailExecute. Now let's scroll up in this main viewModel class. You can see that the method is used for a delegate command that is stored in the createNewFriend command property. Now the renaming didn't work, so I adjust it manually here. It's still underlined in red because it doesn't match the signature that is required for the delegate command. In this case, we need to use the generic delegate command class, and then we can specify the type of the parameter. In this case, we want to have the type of the view model. Besides renaming the method, I also want to rename the property from createNewFriend command to createNewDetail command. So I hit F2 and I rename it. Now when I go again to the execute method, we need to provide that parameter from the user interface. So I open up the main window where we have the menu item to create a new friend. Here you can see the menu item and it binds to the createNewFriend command property of the main view model. But we have renamed this property, so let's call it here also createNewDetail command. To pass in a parameter to the execute method, we use the command parameter property on that menu item. And here we can just use the xType markup extension to pass in the type for the friend detail view model. When I scroll up a bit, you can see that we used the friend detail view model already here for the data template. So we have already that view model namespace mapping. I scroll down again, and here on the command parameter property I use the view model namespace to access the friend detail view model class. Now we have assigned the type friend detail view model to the command parameter property. Now I run the application again. Let's go to the main view model and let's add a breakpoint here. I try to create a new friend and our onCreateNewDetailExecute method is called, and the viewModelType parameter contains the type friend detail view model. So the viewModel name property of the OpenDetailView event args will be set to friend detail view model. And this is correct, so I can continue, and you see we get the screen to create a new friend. So I just add a new friend here, and I click save, and the friend is now in the Friend Organizer application. Now let's see what else we can refactor in the Friend Organizer application. In this demonstration you will refactor the friend repository class together with me so that we can reuse its logic also for other entities and not just for the friend entity. You will learn how to create a reusable generic repository base class. Let's switch to Visual Studio. The Data Repositories folder of the Friend Organizer UI project contains the friend repository class and also the iFriend repository interface. Let's start our refactoring in the iFriend repository interface. Here we just create a new interface that we call iGenericRepository. It gets a generic type parameter t that we use to specify the entity type. Now when you look at the iFriend repository interface, you can see that we can move the first 5 methods to our new iGenericRepository interface. I replaced the type friend with our generic type parameter t. I also changed the friend ID parameter here to ID, and also here we have a parameter with the name friend. I just change it to model. Now our iFriend repository interface can just extend our new iGeneric repository interface of type friend. So now it looks very clean. The remove phone number method is something that is specific to an iFriend repository. We don't want to move this method to our new iGeneric repository interface. So now we are done with the interface. I place the cursor on the interface and I press Ctrl- to move the interface to its own file. Now let's continue with the class. I open up the friend repository class, and in this file I add another class that I call generic repository. This generic repository class implements our new interface iGeneric repository, but we need to specify the generic type parameter. So let's add here a parameter for the entity. Now I press Ctrl- to implement this interface. To be able to implement the methods like this add method, we need the DB context. So when I scroll down, you can see that the DB context might be specific for a repository. This means we need an additional generic parameter on our generic repository class for the context. I just add a parameter that I call tContext, and I rename the first parameter by pressing Ctrl-RR to tEntity. Now we can add a constructor for this generic repository, and the constructor takes a tContext. We store that context in a read-only field that we will generate by pressing Ctrl-. Here the last option is generate read-only field generic repository context. Now we can use this context in our add method. But when I look at the methods, I don't see the methods of the DB context. This is because we don't have a type constraint on this type parameter. So let's add here a constraint. Our tContext type should be a DB context. Now when I go back to the add method, you can see that we get several methods from the DB context from Entity Framework. Now we can use the generic set method to get the DB set for the entity that is specified over the generic type parameter. But everything is underlined in red. When I hover this method call, you can see that the type tEntity must be a reference type. This means we also need a constraint for the tEntity parameter. The tEntity needs to be a reference type, which means it needs to be a class. Now the method call is fine, and we can just call the add method on our DB set for this model. Now we are already done with the add method. Let's scroll down to the friend repository class, and let's inherit this class from our new generic repository class for a friend and with a friend organizer DB context. Now we don't need to store the context anymore in this class because we can access it from the base class. But here the constructor needs to call the base constructor that requires the context. We don't need to implement the add method in this class anymore. Now let's scroll down to the hasChanges method. This one is very simple. We can just cut this here. I remove the whole method and I go up to our generic repository class and I paste the code. We use our context and the change tracker and the hasChanges method, and we just return that value. Now when I scroll down again, we can look at the remove method. This one is also very simple. I cut the content and I remove the remove method. Now I paste the code into the remove method of the generic repository base class. Instead of using the friends property here, I just use the generic set method for our tEntity, and on that DB set I call the remove method for this model. Now I scroll down again to the friend repository and I take a look at the save async method. Okay, this is also very simple. We just call the save changes async method on our context. So I cut this code and I remove the save async method from the friend repository class. I scroll up again and I paste the code here into our save async method. I use the context read-only field and I make this method async. Now let's scroll down a bit and let's fix the friend repository class. In the remove phone number method, we just need to use the context read-only field from our base class. But this one is not visible, so let's see what Visual Studio tells us. It's inaccessible due to its protection level. So I scroll up to the generic repository base class and I make this a protected read-only field. I also change the constructor to protected so that this class can only be used as a base class. Now the only error is left in the getById async method. So here I also use the context from our base class. But now this getById async method hides the method from the base class. So you can see it hides inherited member generic repository getById async. In fact, we didn't implement this method in our base class yet. So let's do this. Here we just grab the context and we get the set again for the specified entity type, and we use the findAsync method to find the entity by this ID. And then we can return the result by using the await keyword. And we also need to mark our getById async method as async. Now we have an implementation of this method that will get a single entity by ID. But when you look at the friend repository class, we also need to include the phone numbers when we grab the entity. This means this logic is specific for the friend repository. So we just scroll up to the getById async method and we make this method a virtual method. Now we can scroll down again to the friend repository class and we just override this method from the base class here. Now we are done with the refactoring. We have moved all the special methods like saveAsync, remove, hasChanges, getById async and add to a generic repository base class. I place the cursor on the class and I press Ctrl- to move that type to its own file. Now I think you agree that our friend repository looks very clean. And we can reuse the code that we have implemented in our generic repository in the next module when we build a meeting repository for a meeting entity. But before we do this, let's also see how we can refactor the friend detail view model.